Well, that's one way to say goodbye to your friends. Patreon sponsored review for this one, and this is a film that I had heard of the name of, knew almost nothing about, and have now seen. It's called The Man from Earth. Now, it's funny. The folks who have been so far sponsoring the Patreon reviews have not requested me to do additional research on the films that have been commissioned, but I find myself doing it anyway because the projects are kind of interesting. So this was an incredibly low budget film. I believe it had a $200,000 budget, which is nothing. That's not even the catering budget on a mid-size movie. So this, and I'll go spoiler free for as long as I can. I am going to describe the setup and premise, and also I'm going to advise that if this intrigues you at all, don't watch the trailer. It doesn't really spoil a lot, but it does sort of indicate some of the directions of some of the later half elements of the film, so I would advise against that. But anyway, this is one of those movies that is just a group of people sitting down and talking. That is the whole movie. I tried to think of some other examples off the top of my head. I kept coming back to My Dinner with Andre, which I don't know if anybody even my age, much less younger, has even heard of, much less seen that movie. I have, for the record. Pretty good, actually. But, it's single location and just characters talking. That's not to say nothing happens, but what happens is all characters shifting in terms of their stance on things, their thoughts, their understanding, their comfort levels with everything that's going on. That's the story. There's no action in it. There's no sequence of events. It's just watching these characters play out this evening. So the starting premise is we have a collection of college professors and one student. And one of them, a guy named John, he's leaving. And he hasn't really explained why to any of the other folks that are there. I mean, they've all gathered for, kind of a goodbye and a send-off, but, he won't say why he's leaving beyond just, I do this from time to time. I think it's just time I moved on. And on a whim, he decides that he's going to tell them what he claims to be the truth, which is that he has been alive since the Cro-Magnon era of humanity. He doesn't get older, and he's moving on because it's been about 10 years and people are starting to notice that he's not seeming to get older. So that's usually his cue to move on to somewhere else. And then it's just conversations going on between all these characters, sort of dismissing, processing, considering the possibility, looking at the implications, even if only in a thought experiment kind of way, getting offended, getting intrigued, all these different angles and opinions based off that one starting premise, and that's the film. So the cast is pretty good in this, and there's like a couple of I know that person, but I don't know their name people. The only one whose name I actually knew was Tony Todd, but it's really it's well written in terms of having a collection of characters whose reactions to not just the starting premise, but every stage of the conversation as it continues is varied enough that it keeps things moving forward and it keeps things from getting dull, because all the various professors there have different backgrounds. There is a sociologist, there's a paleontologist, there is an art historian, there's a biologist, there's a psychiatrist, and they're all sort of coming at what John is saying from different angles, in addition to, their actual personalities, and other beliefs that they have beyond their academic pursuits that are coming into play. And everybody's balanced pretty well. I was surprised. There's the biologist who's because you also get a taste of these guys' personalities. Like, the biologist is, the funny one of the group. You get that that's his shtick, and he knows that's his shtick, and he does it a lot. But at the same time, it doesn't become grating, because that kind of thing can become grating really quickly. But he's balanced really well, and there is just enough of that genuine sort of him mulling all this over in his head, and he'll make a joke, but you can tell he's still kind of latched in and trying to dig at what's going on. And then you've got somebody like the paleontologist, who is very obviously the cool professor. He's got his hair pulled back in a ponytail. He shows up on a motorcycle. He's kind of a tool. And you see how all this stuff factors in. Now, this is not a very cinematic movie. This is one of those films that I watch and I have a tendency to think to myself, why was this ever a film? Why wasn't this just a play? And I think I might be slightly validated on that, because apparently the director, about 5 years after this film was made, adapted it into a play, which is supposedly pretty good. I would imagine it is, because it is just so straightforward that there's no reason for this to be a movie instead of a play. And I don't mean that as a knock. It's good. There was no reason for 12 Angry Men to be done as a film, because it works absolutely as a play. I think that film might be one that folks have actually seen that I can make a comparison to, although it's not as intense as that story is. But there isn't a lot that the camera adds. There isn't a sense of atmosphere brought by the choice of angles, by the framing, by that the camera's just kind of there. And it's not distracting. It's not badly filmed, but it's very pedestrian. And this is the kind of thing in general that I think I do prefer to see on stage, because I tend to get into a headspace where I'm digesting these sort of character pieces a little bit better when it's a play. But it was interesting and it was intriguing, and the way and the pace that it all unfolded worked really well, because it's the sort of thing that these sorts of things for me often can start and I'm like, that's really interesting, and then a half hour in I'm like, you have burned through all your ideas and yet we're still here. And I didn't feel that was the case here, and there's a lot of really interesting responses, especially from John, the main character, in regards to how he answers so many of the questions that get thrown at him. I'm gonna be getting a little bit into spoilers in a minute, I think, because there were a couple of points where it didn't lose me, but I started to disengage a little bit, but then would pull me back, but then I disengaged again. And so to get into that, I'd have to I do have to get into spoilers. So if you enjoy these sort of talky, I don't want to say philosophical, because that implies a more distant thing, because it is much more about people and their reactions, and there is more emotion to it than I wouldn't want to call it a philosophical film, but it is just it is just a conversation. It's an hour 40 conversation. That is what you are watching. So if that kind of thing can intrigue you, and you're into a little bit of sci-fi, or honestly it's almost borderline magical realism, in terms of the way the premise is handled, give it a shot. It's an interesting little film. So if you're still here, getting into spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Some of the specifics about what John says he encountered, and then later what he did, specifically in returns to the more religious end of the conversation, it disengaged from me, and then some of how that played out felt a little bit clunky to me. So when he mentioned having met Buddha, I kind of rolled my eyes at that, because I don't know, it's like when people are really into the idea that they have had past lives, but they always insist that they used to be Cleopatra or Joan of Arc. Nobody ever says, I was a long succession of peasants in the Middle Ages, all of whom died at 20. You know, nobody ever says that. They have to make an association with some big name, somebody famous. And this had the ring of that. Like, it's not like the idea of somebody having been alive for thousands of years and have experienced as much as he did, especially the way he talks about it, where, like, you know, they'll try and quiz him on specific things and, like, you know, where were you this exact date last year? Can you tell me that? Why are you asking me where I was in 1120 AD? So, you know, his way of approaching that is all really intriguing in the first place. So to start basically name dropping and be like, oh yeah, I hung out with Buddha, it's like, oh, it's unnecessary. And it feels like it's trying too hard. Now that does end up factoring into what happens a little bit later, which is basically that John claims to be Jesus, kind of by accident. Like, he met Buddha and he took the teachings from Buddha and readapted them and taught what he thought was, you know, something that would help people. And then his teaching is eventually being recorded by other people and then re-recorded, retranslated, etc., became the Christ story. And again, it's sort of, it's almost the story becoming too big for its own good. And then it also brings out some elements that I don't like in one of the characters, because one of the characters is, you know, she's not only a professor, but she is also, it would appear, a fairly devout Christian. And I feel like that was handled really ham-fistedly. I don't know a lot about the guy who wrote this. Jerome Brixley, I believe. So I don't know about him, and I don't know if this is the case, but the way she's written feels like it feels like how an atheist would write a person of faith. You know, it just has that kind of caricature reaction to things, and it's really kind of the only area where you get the heavy caricaturing, and you know, some of these characters come across fairly broad, but they still feel like there's depth and there's a little bit of nuance to them. There's a little bit more than what's on the surface, and it doesn't feel like the writer and or the director really had a proper understanding of how someone of faith would react to what was going on, and they just went with, oh, she's angry and she's gonna say it's sacrilege, and it's like, whoa. She's also an academic and an intellectual, and like, you're just assuming the most knee-jerk reaction out of her, which is the least interesting possible reaction she could have had. And I'm not saying, like, don't address how this is potentially shaking her faith, or at least making her really uncomfortable. You can address that, but the way in which they did it just felt like the low-hanging fruit way to do it. And then the very end also overreached a little bit, because we've got the psychiatrist, and actually what happens towards the end with him coming to a realization that John was telling the truth and realizing that the two of them have a history together. See, that should be dumb, but honestly it felt like it was played just right, and it turned into a really sweet moment. And then the guy keeled over, like from a heart attack or something, and I rolled my eyes at that. I just flat, I was like, that you overreached, because honestly it almost felt like an overreach just at the revelation, but the way the guy reacted and responded, and the sense of confusion and anger and joy that he was really good at bringing across, it made it a really touching moment. And then he's just kind of and he falls down. It's like, what the hell? So, that was a little bit of a sour final note, which was unfortunate. Because like I said, I do like this piece. I enjoy these kinds of character pieces. Again, I'm more used to, and I'm sort of more at home seeing them on a stage. But I enjoy them because they get me thinking about characters, about people, about how they interact, how they talk. And it's stuff like this that will often send me off, to my notebooks, to scribbling out bits of dialogue, bits of ideas. It's stuff like this that usually ends up with me having written something after having seen and digested stuff like this. So I did like it, and I did appreciate it. And I want to thank my Patreon sponsor for strong-arming me into doing it. So, yeah. And yeah, as you can guess, it is actually possible on the Patreon page to contribute at a level where you get to flat out say something that I have to review. Even if it's something I wouldn't normally review. Even if you deliberately are picking something that you think I'm gonna hate. Which hasn't happened yet. I feel it's coming though. But honestly, I haven't talked specifically to the Patreon in a while. Even if you don't want to contribute at that high level, just being even a minimum level support patron, you get to participate in exclusive polls to help me decide things like what's the next classic Doctor Who episode I'm going to review, the next Big Finish episode. When I have competing ideas or like two things that come out, I don't know what to release first, I'll poll my patrons. So it is just at any level of support, you get to basically have more kind of direct input onto the future direction of this channel, and you're helping making it better, in theory. We'll see. So, The Man from Earth. Interesting little film. So that'll about wrap it up for me. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all the stuff to do, such as like and subscribe. I mentioned the Patreon. I won't mention it again, but links for that and a ton of other stuff by me down in the description. So until next time, this council is adjourned.